Okay, Urs Gasser.
So first of all, let me clarify, neither Windsurf nor I are Boston city officials despite wearing a tie.
I'm sorry, it's all the clothes I got, so it's just the way it is.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's fantastic. Very rich day. Okay, so what do we need for a responsible and innovative web? Cover that in half an hour. Well, we'll see. I would like to share 3 quick observations, hopefully building up on some of the points that we touched upon throughout the day, and also with an eye towards policy making. My first point actually is, as users, parents, teachers, corporate decision makers, policy makers, I think we need a balanced understanding and view on both the opportunities and challenges associated with digital technologies, especially when it comes to youth online. Today's discussion was fantastic and a very balanced exploration of both risks as well as these tremendous promises of the internet. But in my conversations with parents and teachers, as well as policymakers sometimes, the debate is much more one-sided. And to make things worse, it's often fueled and driven by fear and headlines rather than by empirical evidence and data. And I think for the future of the web and for responsible and innovative policy making for an innovative web, we really need to emphasize this point that it is important to craft policies that are driven by data. Amanda Leonhardt was on this panel earlier today, and she and her team are doing tremendous work, for instance, when it comes to youth policy making, where the data they gather can really inform us. Of course, sometimes we have to act under conditions of uncertainty. So we acknowledged also today there are certain things we don't know, and we still have to make decisions, whether as consumers or as policymakers. And in such situations, I think we really need to become more innovative, how we incorporate mechanisms of learning into our decisions and into our organizations and into our policies, because we often don't get it right at the first shot. So how do we ensure learning? The second point I would like to make is more about the approaches or the solution space. We've identified a long list of challenges and potential problems and risks earlier today, ranging from privacy, security, safety issues to concerns of information quality, gaps in skills and literacies. And I think it's a fair summary to say one of the consensus that emerged today is that there is certainly no silver bullet solution to any of these hugely complex phenomena and challenges. And as we move forward, I would argue much of the success of the use of tools as we explored them today a little bit, whether it's educational interventions, whether it's laws and regulation, whether it's reputation systems, you will talk more about that, or other institutions that we use to deal with some of these challenges. We need to really better understand the tools themselves and how they play out in the digital environment. We talked a little bit about the question of how certain solutions scale, especially when dealing with huge amounts of data. The example of YouTube this morning was very, very illustrative, where you see that just this amount of videos that at some point need to be reviewed by human beings because the algorithms are good at flagging and prioritizing but not addressing the core issue. There you see this kind of bottleneck situation. Moreover, still in this category of approaches, we need not only to understand which tool in the toolbox is useful to address which sort of problem that we face online, but also to better understand the interplay among the different instruments that we have available and that we talked about today. In the same cluster, just two quick notes. One, on education. I'm thrilled that we spend so much time and energy today in discussing the promise of education as a potential strategy to cope with some of the thorny challenges. Not only, of course, again, as I said, we didn't only talk about challenges, but also the promises. So education is really important. And at the Berkman Center, for instance, we have currently an experiment underway, and that's what I like about education. You can also run experiments and learn from them. An experiment that we call the Youth and Media Lab, where we bring together high school students and college students with experts in the field on internet policy, and create some sort of a research and development lab for policy making, as well as curriculum development and tool development. So we've heard many other examples from Esther and Nancy, and this power of education, and see it as a potential of innovation is very exciting. The second quick remark in this category is about law. Law, of course, is also a tool, and David Drummond early this morning started with a cautionary note. Of course, don't jump immediately to law and think law will solve all the problems, such as cyberbullying. Of course, the world is much more complex. But one point seems important. We should not mischaracterize law. Law is not only a constraint on behavior, law can also be an enabler. And many of the tools and platforms and applications we've seen today have been enabled by laws, some of them internet-specific laws, actually fostering innovation and protecting innovation. And that's another core pillar, I think, as we move forward, to think carefully about such laws as an infrastructure for a responsible and innovative web in the future. Last point, only quickly, is, and that's the third statement or observation, we should increase interoperability across all layers. Of course, interoperability is a concept many of you in this room here are deeply familiar with at the technological and data layer. Many of the opportunities characterized today, and the web as such, as we presented it, obviously is all about interoperability. The social web is about the flow of data across systems and the meaningful exchange of information. But not only that level of interoperability is important as we move forward, but I would argue also the organizational interoperability, the working together of different stakeholders to address some of the challenges in particular, but also harness the opportunities. Parents, teachers, schools, private companies such as Google and many others need to work hand in hand and really create interfaces of collaboration among institutions. And similarly, at the top layer, we also need to think about legal and policy interoperability. We talked a little bit about legislation in the context of cyberbullying, where you have bullying, where you have different state laws that are not interoperable and putting companies such as Facebook in a tricky position if you want to comply with all the laws. And of course, the international dimension, again, is to be acknowledged, where privacy laws, that was mentioned as well, create all sorts of interoperability problems for global internet companies. So these are my three.
Thanks very much, Urs.
Wow.
And Daniel Kent of Net Literacy, would you like to go next?
Sure. I've prepared some remarks, just so that I'm cognizant of the 5-minute remark.
Terrific.
So I'm honored to be here with two of the most forward-thinking internet visionaries, and I'd like to add my congratulations to Google for convening this discussion. While these gentlemen were busy inventing and crafting the infrastructure and shaping the policy that would come to define the internet, I was growing up as an end user. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that it took me until the 4th grade to open up my beige box and upgrade my RAM to what I think was 256. But you know, that issue of confidence is still a large barrier to individuals around the world in adopting broadband and computers and access devices and learning how to navigate through the net. As a digital literacy practitioner, it was especially poignant when senior citizens told me that they felt that they were too old to learn. Sort of switching gears, Organizations that provide digital inclusion data like Pew and the International Telecommunication Union have highlighted that digital inclusion is a serious barrier to computer and broadband use. Today, those that are offline are being left behind. Tomorrow, those without access to computers and the internet will be, in a very sense, disabled and unable to access the increasing number of services that are migrating to the net and not available to those offline. Those that are disconnected in North America and abroad will become poorer, detached from an increasing torrent of rich information, and less able to compete in school, in the workforce, and in life. As we progress into the 21st century, those that are not net savvy will be increasingly relegated to an underclass that may be subject to an ugliness of a new form of discrimination. Now, 4 years ago, I was a teenager, and I can tell you from very recent experience that to my generation, Web 2.0 and social media is a double-edged sword. You know, as Adora said earlier this morning, while it has empowered us, it has also created new responsibilities. You know, it's social to tweet and +1 or like pages and posts and photos, but unfortunately, members of the digital generation sometimes make poor decisions and post inappropriate pictures or comments. You know, 5 years ago, few fully realized the impact of their future net reputations. But today, scholarship programs, colleges, and employers are regularly Googling applicants. And, you know, it's been recently reported that in the news that some employers are now asking for their employees to turn over their Facebook logins and passwords. Without addressing any of the privacy and other issues, it's clear that what we're doing online today will definitely impact our future well-being. So users need to become more aware and better educated about their net reputation. And I commend Google for creating Me on the Web, a web application that integrates with your current Google account and helps users manage and control what others can find about them on the web and know what know what is published about them online. Not only what you publish, but also what others publish about you. Google and the Berkman Center's initiatives to inform educators and innovators and policymakers and end users is truly the way to build the character of our community of digital citizens. And as we discuss what's on the horizon on this panel, I'll try to have my comments reflect a digital inclusion practitioner's perspective. I'm mindful that without digital inclusion and literacy, some of us will not enjoy the benefits of a responsible and innovative web.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And Mr. Cerf with the home team, would you like to share with us your thoughts?
Wow. Oh, I didn't know we were in a competition. I thought this was supposed to be a cooperative view of what's actually going on. Let me start out by making a couple of observations. I want to focus on responsibility for just a moment. Among the various things we enjoy on the internet, at least many of us, is freedom to speak and to hear and to interact and to share and to collaborate and cooperate. But I think there's a freedom that is often not articulated, and that's freedom from harm, and we are not free from harm. We know that the internet is a place where harms can occur. It's a very complicated environment because the perpetrator of a harm may be in one jurisdiction or one country, and the victim might be in another. This gets to your interoperability question, where it's not clear the jurisdictional boundaries and, let's say, reciprocity is available. So we have a global problem when it comes to coping with improving safety on the internet. I've often concluded that there are only three kinds of things that you can do in order to cope with the safety problem. One, you can create technical means to prevent the harm from happening. You know, smarter operating systems, paranoid browsers that don't let themselves get infected, and so on. But frequently, the technical solution doesn't work, or it's not adequate. So then the next thing you do is you try to figure out how to detect that something bad has happened and then figure out who did it. This is sort of detection and punishment. That's what we do when it comes to drunk driving. We can't stop you, but we pass laws saying if we catch you, there will be consequences. That's the second kind of response that you can have. And the third one is moral suasion. And I don't mean to suggest that's a weak response. I mean, in some cases saying, don't do that, it's bad, it's harmful, it hurts. What if they did it to you? is a pretty good argument. So those are the three elements that I think are very important. I think also what you've been hearing today on the part that I was able to participate in underscores another really important point, the power and importance of infrastructure, because that's really what a lot of this is about. The internet and the World Wide Web and the apps that sit on top of mobiles are a consequence of enabling infrastructure, and I would not ever want to discount the power that kind of enabling infrastructure has. Now, I want to come back to the responsibility question, though, because regardless of those three mechanisms that I mentioned, taking responsibility for the way we behave on the network, I think, is a very important thing. What we don't have, though, on a global scale is a sense of what the social norms should be on a global scale in this online environment. It's come up several times in the earlier conversations. And I don't think that we can make this up. I think we are literally going to end up having to live through this sort of thing. Let me give you a trivial example. When we're walking towards each other down the street, it's generally common that we try to figure out how not to run into each other. It's just socially more convenient that way than smashing into each other and having an argument over who gets out of the way first. That's a trivial example of a social norm, but it's the kind of thing that we need to find in this cyberspace environment. And I think it's the people who are engaged that are going to have to figure out what that is. You know, Perry Aftab has the Teen Angels activity that's been going on for 14 years now. These are kids trying to help other kids to figure out what's the right kind of behavior, what makes sense to them. And those kids are going to be a lot more credible having opinions and suggesting ideas than any adult or any other authority figure is likely to have. What I think, let me give you another example of participatory involvement in trying to create a safer environment. Google and PayPal and several other, Qualys and several other companies have gotten together to form something called Stop Badware, which was originally started in the Berkman Center and then was exported out as a not-for-profit. What it does is respond to the problem of infected websites. When Google does an index of the World Wide Web, we have a crawler that's trying to look at every single web page and makes notes about the ones that it thinks might be infected, because we actually download the web pages and a piece of software looks at it. And if it thinks that there's a piece of malware on the website, it makes a little note saying this site might be dangerous. When somebody does a Google search and one of the results is a link to one of those marked sites, if you click on the link, before we actually let you go there, we pop up this interstitial web page. It's bright red and it says, don't go there, there might be malware on the site. Now, if you happen to be the site owner and somebody comes to you and says, ha, Google says you're infected. And of course, most of these people don't know that. They think they've been insulted. They have all kinds of noise. Comes, I never did anything. And of course, they probably didn't. They probably had a website that wasn't adequately secured. Somebody else infected it for them. So we send them to Stop Badware, and Stop Badware goes through the website with a fine-tooth comb and helps them clean it out. So that's an example of a kind of responsible behavior in this environment, which we know is not purely safe, not absolutely secure. And this is a continuous process. It's not something you just do once. It's like brushing your teeth. If you brush your teeth once in your life, it doesn't do you any good. You have to brush them every day. It's like cyber hygiene, same thing. Now, I realize I don't want to go on and on and on, so let me pick one other point and then get into some discussion. Again, this is responsibility. Personal responsibility for us, in my view, includes critical thinking. What the heck am I talking about? How many times have you gotten a message from somebody that says, the post office is going to start charging a penny for every email and you should, go look it up on Snopes first. I mean, take some responsibility before you propagate nonsense. It's true that there's misinformation on the net, and we're never going to get rid of that. But one thing we can do is be a little bit more thoughtful about deciding whether we should believe this information or not. That's called critical thinking. One of the best lessons that we can teach our kids is how to think critically about the information that they get, because they're not going to get misinformation just on the net. They're going to get it from movies, television, their friends, their parents might be misinformed. There are a variety of sources of misinformation. The kids need to learn how to sort that out as best they can. And if we teach them how to do that, then they will be able to defend against misinformation in all of its forms, not just on the internet. Mr. Chairman, I have one other anecdote to tell you. This is Kissinger's complaint. I had lunch with Henry Kissinger several years ago now, And the first thing he said was he hated the internet. And I thought, well, that's a great way to start out lunch. But the reason he said he didn't like it was that people had become satisfied with too little information. A snippet will do. Now, you understand that Dr. Kissinger writes 700-page books. He wants people to read all 700 pages of the books. He doesn't want them to be satisfied with a paragraph. So he was unhappy about that. On the other hand, the thing that he liked was Google News because he could get a sense for what everybody was talking about in a very rapid way. But he did point out that he's very upset that his grandchildren do not know how to read cursive writing because the only thing they ever see is print. And so all those letters that he has from famous people in history, the kids, his grandchildren, can't read them because they don't read cursive. And I told him I didn't know what to do about that. That's his problem. Mr. Chairman, I turn this over to you, and thank you for the opportunity to sort of hold forth this way.
So, Urs, I wonder, so when Vint was talking about freedom from harm, the third element he mentioned was this idea of moral suasion. And you mentioned very briefly during your remarks reputation systems. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about reputation systems and whether we might see the emergence of perhaps global reputation systems that could actually help us maintain a more responsible web and also serve to help people, end users, navigate the web in a different kind of way.
Great question. I truly believe that reputation system as a governance mechanism has tremendous potential, but at the same time, at least from what I've seen, which is of course only a part of the discussion, it's extremely hard actually to think about the design of such systems because you run into all sorts of issues.
Well, what if somebody lies?
Exactly.
I mean, what if you tell everybody that your competitor, makes bad material and it isn't true, and now we're back to critical thinking?
You have seen it with dentists and so forth, right? In the professional space with teachers as well. What are appeal mechanisms, correction mechanisms, but then perhaps more importantly also thinking about, again, the global context, and Jill could obviously comment on that much better. For a reputation, you need some sort of identification, right? And that's not always desirable, that you have full authentication on the web and that every action, every expression, every comment can be attributed to a particular speaker, right? And there are mechanisms, I think, in computer science how you can still have persistent identities, build reputation systems, but not lose anonymity. But that's hugely complex as a design challenge.
Can we keep going on this just a little bit? First of all, I think anonymity is still very important. We all understand there are situations where non-anonymous speech is fatal. So we need to preserve in this environment the ability to speak pseudonymously, as well as sometimes it's important to be able to speak in an authoritative way with your name and make sure other people can believe that it's you and not somebody else pretending to be you. So on this side of reputation systems, though, it is possible in this space to have brands that do not necessarily identify an individual, but which simply by their repeated value, their content, will establish brand and therefore establish reputation. So if there are people on the net who make comments on blogs. I don't know who they are. They have a handle. But if the handles tend to be thoughtful, then you want to give more credibility to that. And I am always nervous about the mechanics of reputation systems for the reasons that you described. Any engineer who's trying to design something needs to think not only how is it going to work, but how is it going to be abused and how do I deal with that?
One thing that strikes me, and this is a theme that's come up in a number of our panels so far, is this idea that many of the problems that arise in the real world arise in the web as well. So for example, when we're talking about reputation systems, credit scores don't work terribly well. But it's a fairly kind of lawless, thing where you have kind of several different companies that provide them, and sort of it's something that's emerged over time. It's kludgy. And so when you think rigorously about, well, people are providing this public good, but in a way, in a for-profit context, and it's just out there and we use it in an imperfect way. And that actually brings me to a remark that Vint had made earlier. You talked about much of what Google does in the context of identifying sites with malware, et cetera. So that work could be understood as a kind of provision of a public good. Yet, of course, Google is an organization that is constrained, and it's also an organization that has been very much shaped by the recent retreat of many websites from the open web to the closed web.
Yes.
And I wonder how you think about that evolution and the implications of that for a kind of a generative and responsible web. Because again, if you're a sheriff of this terrain that is actually shrinking as more and more of the web is closed, that presumably introduces all kinds of dilemmas.
Can I make two observations? First of all, we've had this happen before. AOL, for example, started out as very much a closed system and was forced by the users to go outward. So my honest belief here is that the pendulum may be swinging, and that the users will, if the users find that a closed environment gives them a poorer quality experience, a limitation in the amount of information they have available, more difficulty in finding things that are relevant, etc., or ability to see across a broader spectrum of content, then they're going to push back. So that's one possibility. The second thing is that to bring back the responsibility point, if companies like Google can't see those things, and therefore we can't help protect people against that. That is an opportunity for someone to design systems that go in the browser that are a lot more paranoid about what they download, because the browsers will see the content that's inside that wall, and so they now become the operative opportunity for detecting that there's something wrong. But that means better browser design than we have today. That's why we've done Chrome, et cetera, et cetera.
Urs, I wonder, because you're at this intersection of kind of the academic world and also working on public policy questions, et cetera. I want to press a little bit further on that idea of the public goods provider, because again, when that public goods provider is a for-profit firm that faces its own larger strategic context, what do you think about what other civil society actors can do to help buttress that public goods role, or perhaps kind of see to it that that role is carried out, kind of when this firm or that firm fades from the scene?
It goes a little bit back to my interoperability point. I truly believe that some of the challenges we identified and addressed, as well as the possibilities, we can only deal with them successfully if you really work together. And of course, that includes that working together includes the development of a strategy of working together and a public policy discussion also about checks and balances. So I share your concern. That of course it's troublesome if some pieces of core infrastructure, and of course made this excellent point, how important infrastructure is, could not only be the fiber optics, right, or the cables in the ground, also search and platforms of communication. If that core infrastructure is in the hand of private companies, we certainly have an institutional challenge and need to have a conversation as a society. How do we build in checks and balances? How do we reallocate mechanisms of control and supervision? And these are tricky questions, and we don't have good answers yet.
Daniel, I wonder, so given that your mission is to increase net literacy and to bring people and digital inclusion, it occurs to me that there is a sense in which having a more cognizable, accessible space that is moving away from an anarchic web to a web that is kind of that consists of walled gardens might actually be advantageous from your perspective. Does that make sense to you, or do
No, it really does. But I think one thing to take in consideration is it's probably definitely going to be a balance going forward. and one thing that we try to do is we try to use a lot of education for the end user. And in that respect, Net Literacy is a student volunteer, completely student organized and student run nonprofit. And what we do is we try to teach how individuals should be safe online and how to navigate the web in a responsible manner. And I think that working on both fronts is really sort of the key to really addressing the situation, because there's so many stakeholders, and there probably won't be one true solution.
Vint, I wonder, there is this, and this is taking off from Daniel's observation, there is this great anxiety that the so-called appliancization of the web is actually changing the way that users think about how they use the web. So I wonder, you express this confidence, it seemed to me, that eventually users might decide, wait a second, we don't like these walled gardens, we prefer a kind of more open environment. But do you fear that actually the way we use the web is actually shaping the way we think about it and actually what we imagine to be the generative potential of the web. So do you worry that a kind of new generation of web users who are being weaned in the context of these walled gardens might not demand a more open web, that in fact they might actually be trained to actually stay between the lines, as it were?
It's possible. Let me suggest a couple of metaphors here that might be useful. First of all, you hear about the World Wide Web occasionally, and people think about the settling of the West. You know, you have the pioneers, the explorers, and the pioneers come, and they have to shoot the Indians or whatever it is that, in order to survive. There's all this conflict and lawlessness and everything else, and then when you finally settle, you find people demanding more safety. And that's what governments are about. Governments, in part, are supposed to be there to act in the public interest to provide a safer environment for everyone. So my belief here is that as we settle this environment, we'll be looking for more certainty and predictability about what things can happen to us and what we can do about things that we don't want to have happen. It's conceivable that there will be some sense of safety arising out of these walled kinds of environments. But I have to tell you that when the World Wide Web first showed up, there were two really important lessons that are relevant to something you said earlier and something that I think is important to all of us. The first one is the enormous amount of content that flowed onto the net because people had a way of expressing themselves and they wanted to share what they knew, and this was not driven by a desire for remuneration. It was driven by a desire that someone find what you knew to be interesting and useful. The second thing that's very important, and which goes to your point about how we learn to be safer on the net, do you remember that when web pages first showed up, the browsers allowed you then and still allow you to actually see how that web page was constructed, show source or view source? The webmasters taught each other. You were allowed to copy some other webmaster's technique. You could try out new ideas and other people could learn from that. What I hope, and I don't know how to do this yet, but what I hope is that we have a similar kind of way of making transparent what people choose to do to make themselves feel safer and be safer in the internet environment. If we can find a way of making the viral learning happen, that would be a good thing. So to come back to the primary question, I believe that there is so much pent-up desire to share information with other people that there will be resistance to staying inside the walls. The 60 hours a minute going into YouTube, I don't know what the number is now, but that's what I've heard recently, per minute, is evidence of this great continuing desire to share what you know and share what you have. And I don't see walled gardens supplying you necessarily with that capability.
Thanks so much, you guys. I'm afraid we're already over time, and I wonder, perhaps we could address a couple of questions before we wrap up.
Did you say wrap up or crap out?
Wrap up.
I'm sorry, okay.
Same thing.
Yeah, right. Same.
Good afternoon. My name is William Clements, and thank you for the robust panel. Given that we see that the internet is just a reflection of the people who use it, what are the, let's say, best practices or mechanisms that can be leveraged to, one, increase user-level accountability and responsibility without sacrificing openness as well as without sacrifice creativity? And with that being said, what are some of the best practices with that? What can we do now to implement that vision? And then what is the vision of the ideal web in which we can be innovative yet protected?
That is an extraordinarily broad question you've asked, and I'm glad you asked it. Daniel, do you want to take a first crack at it?
Sure. I feel that really it's about empowering the users, and that through education and through sort of a bottom-up approach, users and will be able to really grasp the concepts that they're not just one individual in a morass of everything that's going on in the net, but they're a citizen in a community that they have a responsibility to to do unto others as you would want others to do unto you.
Anyone else?
I would share that view and argue, well, it's kind of a concentric circle model potentially, right, where it starts with every single individual user, this notion of self-responsibility and be a good citizen on the web. And then the social norms dynamics kicks in the family context, with your friends, with your online and offline friends, of course, and it goes on. And at the outer circles, of course, you have companies such as Facebook or Google, but also then ultimately policy and lawmakers. So I think it's, again, a shared responsibility, but you start with the individual and the individual user that really has a role to play here. Take responsibility.
We have time for one more.
Can I jump in on that
please,
one? I may wipe out the next question as a result, but I want to give an engineer's response to that question. Because I'm talking to if there are any engineers in the audience or who see this video later, listen, you have a responsibility. When you build systems, you need to think about how they're going to be abused. You have to think about how to build in better protection. You need to give tools to people who want to be responsible but don't necessarily have any time or ability to go down into the details. When you put automatic braking systems into the car, you do that to help people be more responsible because they don't necessarily know how to go pump the brakes whenever they're skidding on ice. The whole point here is that we don't give people enough tools to be responsible citizens. This business about changing your password every 30 seconds or something and, keeping a list of 700 of them so none of them are the same, that's silly. We really need to do a better job of providing tools that let people be responsible without so much crazy effort, because they can't. It's just not possible. So, I would go on and on, but I won't. The point here is that when a civil engineer gets a license as a civil engineer and builds a bridge and the bridge collapses, if it's demonstrable that the civil engineer's design was faulty as opposed to the implementation or the materials were faulty, he bears liability. Now, I'm sure I've just scared every programmer in the country by suggesting that there's liability for bugs in the program, but we should be thinking along those terms, not necessarily making legal liability, because believe me, bugs in programs are going to be with us until the cows come home. But being more thoughtful and feeling responsibility for dealing with that problem is absolutely essential.
We have time for one concise question, I think.
We have one question.
There's one way over there. In the dark, would you like to come and be visible? So the camera can catch you.
Should I come here?
Please do.
Okay.
Enter into the light.
So there's been a craving for fact-checking on the internet. So a lot of people see things like which are obviously wrong, and then they say this is not the fact, and we need to make sure every blogger writes the actual fact. And you can assume that companies, you can imagine situations where companies like Google, as you type your blog post, will suggest things that are facts to you in the future, which is what Google is trying to do, trying to move towards helping the user. So my question is, who decides what fact is? Do you let these companies decide what fact is, or do you encourage users to write things that are not factual, but might be imaginative or creative, which will expand users' understanding?
It occurs to me there are some nested assumptions in that question, but Urs, would you like to field that question?
I think it's
Vin, please.
Well, I would actually like some help, because in spite of the fact that the question came into the light, I couldn't hear all of it, and I can't lip read him from the dark. So you need to help me understand
I believe
what the
the question was about the notion is that we ought to encourage facts rather than the proliferation of false statements, and that we might use technology somehow to encourage the propagation of information that is true rather than false.
So, I wish that I had, Harry Potter's magic wand to make that happen. I don't think I can. In fact, if anything, responsible journalism is evaporating on us, and we are getting, instead of reportage and fact, we're getting opinion. The op-ed page is bled off into the news page, and if I've offended any newspaper journalists here, it was on purpose. I actually don't know of a technology that will necessarily do anything, but the reputation system notion that came up here feels like there might be a place there where lots of eyes looking on something can react. And the earlier comments that Tiffany made about the Coney situation and the response of all those eyes looking at that story and saying, wait a minute, that might turn out to be the path to which we can deal with the problem you're describing. But it's very clear that it's a big problem and we have to do something. Critical thinking is part of it. Reacting, if you know better, is important to share.
Well, one thing I'll say just to push back against that slightly is that another way to think about it is attention blindness. I mean, there's this notion that, you could say that, well, X or Y isn't true. Another way of saying it is that, look, I'm looking at a different angle on the situation, and because I'm focusing on this particular aspect of a given large, complex, unruly phenomenon, it's necessarily going to be in tension with someone else's characterization of it. And so one thing that worries me is that when you have the idea of a technological solution, the underlying premise is that there is some true interpretation. And I think the trouble is that, when you have a much more small d democratic way, you have far more people who are enabled to actually offer their narratives concerning some situation, then necessarily it's going to look as though, well, there's more chaos, and there are more things that are said that are not true. But in fact, another way of looking at it is that, well, we actually have the wherewithal, the ability to kind of have more angles on a given situation. So that is going to look chaotic, and it does, you do need to be a responsible user to be able to navigate that world. But I wouldn't say that we're necessarily seeing kind of a diminution of kind of what is true in terms of our information diets. But
You're channeling Esther Dyson. Esther has this wonderful quote. She says, the antidote for bad information is more information, not censorship.
Absolutely.
Not that I'm accusing you of censorship,
No.
But I mean, it's a really solid observation. We have the responsibility to try to find out as best we can what the real answers are or what the real truth is. And if we don't do that, then we're the ones, we harm ourselves.
Well, everyone, we have a reception now at which you can pepper these guys with even more questions. So thank you so much for joining us. This was great fun for me, and I hope it was fun for you as well, and informative, more to the point, and not full of lies.
I hope not, anyway.